Well, hello, Mayor, council members, and community. My name is Sue Hagener, Administrative Services Director of the City of Sequim, and today I'm going to give you an overview of the financial performance of the city for 2021. These results are not yet audited. We get audited annually by the State Auditor's Office. They were behind schedule last year, so we expect them to come this next fall and audit 2 years of our financial statements. And for those of you that don't know this, the City of Sequim uses cash basis accounting to record its financial transactions. A basis of accounting refers to when revenues and expenses are recognized in the accounting records. Cash basis means that revenues are recorded when they are received and expenses are recorded when we write the checks. So there's no such thing as a receivable or a payable. The only assets that we ever report on are beginning and ending cash and investment balances or fund balances. Cash basis accounting is allowed by the Washington State Auditor's Office, who by law are required to prescribe, formulate, and install a system of accounting and reporting for all local governments in Washington State. And hence they are required to audit us against those requirements. There's a total of about 2,000 agencies existing in Washington State right now. That includes towns and cities and counties and water districts, etc. About 75% of them use cash basis, and primarily because it's really user-friendly, while still requiring sound internal controls and excellent accounting practices. Generally accepted accounting principles, or the accrual basis of accounting, is super complex. It requires a ton of resources, meaning staff and time, and it's constantly changing. So the trend within Washington State is actually to move away from accrual accounting to cash basis. Okay, so now on to the financial performance of the city in a nutshell. All operational funds, meaning the general fund, streets, water, and sewer, all of them had very strong revenues. We did see inflationary impacts on our expenses, supply chain issues raising the cost of supplies and materials, but we still ended the year in all of our funds in compliance with our budget. So we were under budget for our expenses. We ended the year with excellent fund balances, and you'll hear throughout the materials and throughout the presentation that changes in the accounting for overhead did have kind of some unusual impacts on our revenues and expenses. Most revenues that were impacted by COVID in 2020 have rebounded, with the exception of rentals, which is a very small portion of our revenues. And you will also see in the materials delayed and postponed capital projects. Not a lot of capital project expenses in 2021, basically due to staffing, retirements, and just moving on. We are witnessing the Great Resignation right now. So you have a lot of materials in your packet today, including this presentation, as well as narratives on all of our major funds and how they performed. You've got some graphs. And you've got this particular document, which is our one-stop shop summary of how all the funds performed for the year 2021. I'll point you to some important columns to pay attention to. Column 1, budgeted revenues for the year by fund. Column 2, actual revenues for the year. In the column next to that, you'll see that the difference, over or under budget. So for the general fund, we budgeted about $12 million in revenues. We recorded in about $11.6 million, and the difference is $504,000, or 4% under budget. That's again primarily due to our overhead allocation changes. Columns 3 and 4 are our budgeted expenses for the year versus our actual expenses for the year. for a difference of about $1 million. We were about $1 million under budget in the general fund, again, primarily due to overhead allocations. And finally, column 5, you'll see the net gain or the net loss by fund. And finally, in column 6, you'll see the ending fund balance or ending cash and investments. And that is the column that we compare to our reserve policies or our ending fund balance policies. So let's talk about the general fund. We started the year with a very healthy fund balance. That's always good news. And all of our revenues exceeded expectations, with the exception of charges for goods and services, which is where we used to record overhead revenue, and miscellaneous, which was impacted by closing down of our facilities to rental revenue. But you can see that even when we did a couple of budget amendments last year to record excess sales tax, we still exceeded our expectations by about $333,000. So let's talk a little bit more about sales tax. This graph shows the 5 major categories of sales tax receipts. And you can see that we budget and we record sales tax on a monthly basis. The 5 categories are food and accommodations, construction, retail, wholesale, and other. And you can see down the far right-hand side of the graph, you can see our actual receipts by month and our budgeted receipts by month. One thing I wanted to let you or remind you of is that we receive our sales tax receipts about 2 months behind. So you can see in February, we took in the receipts for December or for Christmas. And in September, we took in the receipts right around the Lavender Festival. And you can see that those are some of the largest monthly receipts that we take in. Sales tax is extremely important to the general fund. It can be spent on anything, and it represents about over 50% of the taxes that we take in to the general fund. This is a historical look at our sales tax receipts going back 20 years. You can see on the far left-hand corner of the graph where we started to bring box stores into Sequim. You can see that nice little dip up. You can see the boom in 2006 through approximately 2008. And even though that little dip right next to it doesn't look that significant, the Great Recession had a significant impact on the revenues of the city. It took us approximately 5 or 6 years to actually begin to recover from the Great Recession. And the good news on the far left-hand side of the graph is where we are today. And although we do have record sales tax, one of the most difficult things about boom periods is to figure out what portion of that sales tax is actually sustainable. So we do tend to be conservative in terms of projecting and budgeting our revenues, which is a good news because we have a lot of things to pay for this year. As our city manager, Matt Hewish, has mentioned to you many times, we are really struggling with staff retention and with staff hiring. So we need to make some significant changes related to staffing. We also have 3 union contracts to pay for. So although we have record sales tax in 2021 and still look good going into 2022, it's very difficult to figure out what portion of that is sustainable. Okay, let's talk about overhead allocations or allocation of central services. A central service is a department that provides a benefit or a service to another department. So, for example, quite a few of my staff here in finance All they do is provide utility billing services to the water and sewer departments. So the whole concept of allocating overhead is to charge the departments benefiting from those services equitably for the services that they receive. And this is a historical look at our overhead revenue over time, going back about 10 years. You can see in 2021, there's a significant decline in the overhead revenues recorded to the general fund, and that's due to the change in accounting practices. As I mentioned before, my finance staff providing services to the water and sewer funds, well, instead of recording instead of recording that charge as revenue back to the general fund, I actually net the expense, reducing the expenses in the general fund when I charge those out to the water and sewer funds. And so we had over $800,000 in what we call direct posts to other funds benefiting from central services. One of the reasons why the general fund typically performs well, even in times of trouble like COVID, is because we have a variety of revenues that we rely on to fund our operations. We talked about sales tax. There's also property tax and utility tax. That's a good mix of revenues. Utility tax typically grow at a rate of about 5% per year. They compose about 22% of our total taxes, and they tend to be very stable. So this is just a historical look at our utility tax, and you can see it provides about $1.7 million in revenues to the general fund. And the different colors you see are the different categories: electric, water, sewer, cable, telephone. The only kind of anomaly that's happening right now with utility tax is that people are tending to move away from telephones and towards other types of services like cable. So let's talk a little bit about general fund expenses. General fund expenses are about $1 million under budget. Wages and benefits were under by about $767,000 or 10%, and that's due to what I mentioned earlier about the finance department getting charged out to the water and sewer funds, where we're netting that charge against the expense in the general fund when we charge the benefiting fund. So on the slide here it says $550,000 of that was due to the accounting change. Supplies were under, services were under, intergovernmental was under, and we had no capital purchases. As I've mentioned many times before, wages and benefits tend to be the most significant expense in our operational funds. This is a historical look at wages and benefits in the general fund going back in time over 10 years. You can see we've had an average increase in wages of about 4% over that time, and an average increase in benefits of about 5%. Wages and benefits compose about 71% of the expenses in the general fund for 2021. And you can also see we've added staff over the years. On the far left-hand side, we started the graph with 55 FTE, and now we're up to 64 FTE, which is consistent again with the growth of our community. And finally, we ended the year with about $3.3 million in the general fund balance, which exceeds actually our policy maximum. So we're doing great. We're always comparing our ending fund balances to what our target policy is. Our target policy for the ending fund balance is between $2 million and $3 million for the general fund. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about compliance with financial policies in the next presentation. So overall, the general fund is performing very well. So let's talk about street operations. And why are street operations so important? Well, because roads are very important to our citizenry. And street operations has very few revenue sources other than revenues coming from other places in the city. So for example, the largest revenue source to street operations is a transfer in from the general fund. So the general fund doesn't just support general governmental operations, it also supports our street operations to the tune of $560,000 a year, which is most of the revenues. We do use a little bit of TBD tax that's transferred in from a restricted fund to pay for safety and maintenance. And you can see on the left-hand side of the slide that very little motor vehicle tax comes in to support total expenses exceeding $900,000 last year. Now, both revenues and expenses were under budget, but we had to ask for a budget amendment because of the increase in costs for things like de-icer and pavement markings. We ended the year with a very healthy fund balance due to purposeful savings. Again, we have saved money in this fund to give us flexibility in the future if revenues from the general fund are impacted. So how about water operations? Well, water operations, they brought in $2.6 million in revenue, which was 4% over budget, primarily due to the growth in the number of water accounts. And expenses of $2.4 million were basically on target with budget. The only way that we came on target with budget is because we deferred transfers out to some of our water restricted funds to pay for debt and equipment replacement, those types of things, because those fund balances actually could do without it. So we deferred transfers out to some of those funds, ending with a very strong fund balance of $1.5 million, which exceeds our policy maximum. And this is a historical look at water operations revenues and expenses. The revenues are the orange line, the light blue are the expenses, and the dark blue lines are revenues per employee. You can see in 2015 we had 4.5 FTE, whereas in 2021 we had 6.1 FTE. The average growth of revenues in the water fund since 2015 is about 6%. The average expense has grown about 5%. The number of accounts as of 2021 was about 3,000 compared to 2,400 in 2015. And essentially that's 600 more meter reads that have to happen every month by our water crew. Now our sewer operations fund was a slightly different story. We had revenues of $4.7 million, and those were about 4% under budget, primarily due to the fact that our regional partners like the Tribe and Carlsberg just aren't generating the revenues that we originally anticipated. Expenses of $4.7 million were basically on target with budget, and again, as a result of deferred transfers out to our replacement reserves and our debt reserves, because again, those reserves are very healthy and they could do without the transfers in. And we ended the year with a $2.3 million fund balance, which exceeds policy max. So again, very healthy fund balances. And here's a historical look at sewer operations revenue and expenses. Again, you'll see the revenue in the orange line, the expenses in the light blue line, and down at the bottom in the dark blue line is the revenues per FTE. We had 10.5 FTE in 2015. We had 10.8 FTE in 2021. In 2021, those 10.8 FTE were servicing over 3,300 sewer accounts compared to 2,600 sewer accounts in 2015, which again is about 700 more accounts to manage. The growth in the revenues has averaged about 4%. The growth in expenses has averaged about 7%. And that blue line right smack dab in the middle of the graph in 2018, you can see the blue line far exceeds revenues for 2018, and that's because we did a very large transfer out to debt reserves to pay off about $3.6 million in sewer debt early. I think we saved roughly $600,000 or $700,000 over the course of that loan by paying that off early. Now, I just finished talking a little bit about the growth in water revenues and the growth in sewer revenues. Well, that's not because those growth rates aren't because we've raised rates. We've had very few rate increases over the last 7 years. Actually, water has increased an average of just 2%. It's the smallest portion of the bill, so it has the least impact on our customers' total water and sewer bill. And sewers had an average annual increase of 1%. And over the last 7 years, that's resulted in an average increase to the water and sewer bill of less than 1% or 75 cents. So let's talk about our equipment reserve, and we pay attention to the equipment reserve as well because it's primarily funded with general fund dollars and sometimes with transfers in from water and sewer depending on what type of equipment we're buying. We were under budget in the equipment reserve, and again that was after asking for an amendment because again inflationary impacts on prices did impact the cost of some of the equipment that we purchased, as well as supply chain issues. There's a list of the items that we purchased out of our equipment reserve. We ended the year with a pretty healthy fund balance of $1.4 million, which constitutes 101% of the 2.5 years worth of scheduled equipment replacement. So that's according to our policy. So it's well funded and we look good going into 2022. And some other notable funds. They behaved well last year. We've got $552,000 in savings for potential prepayment of debt on our Civic Center. We're eligible to do that in 2023. Lodging tax, you have a specific graph for that in your materials. That far exceeded our expectations. Real estate excise tax, as you have heard, the real estate market is booming. REIT of over $700,000 was $265,000 or 58% over budget. So these are kind of considered one-time revenues and they can only be spent on capital projects identified in the CIP. And our rainy day fund ended the year with a $1.9 million balance after it was replenished for payments out for COVID relief. And everything else was either on target or according to our projections. And this is kind of a fun graph. It's a historical look at real estate excise tax receipts for about 20 years. And again, you can see where we had that boom right about 2005, 6, 7. You can see where we were significantly impacted towards the middle of that graph by the Great Recession. Real estate excise taxes literally dropped to almost nothing during that time. And just get a look of the recovery that we're in right now. On the far right-hand side of the screen, honestly, it's record-breaking real estate excise tax receipts. And again, these can only be used on capital projects in our CIP. One thing of note, we were very conscientious back in the boom times to save a lot of that money. And you might be interested to know that we used, I'm thinking it was roughly $1 million of real estate excise tax that we saved during that boom time to actually put a cash down payment on this Civic Center. So it's in times like these that we really actually need to look to the future and opportunities that might be out there in front of us. And this graph goes back a few years and it looks at our capital expenses. I've categorized them in two different ways. We have streets capital projects in the light blue and all other capital projects in the darker blue. And you can clearly see how staffing impacted our capital projects delivery in 2021. I will say we are so excited that the Public Works folks are staffing up, they're getting their engineer positions filled, and we expect that story to change soon. So I always like to wrap up my financial reports with you with some slides on what is up ahead of us. And that's 2022 budget amendments, at least the first series of them. Not sure how many there's going to be, but these will be coming to you within the next couple of meetings. As you know, our police department union contracts are still being negotiated. Those are in process. We need to bring you some numbers to help pay for those. Our non-uniformed folks, which includes a lot of accounting personnel and our crews out there, water, sewer, street crews, that contract has been completed, but we also need to put money in the budget to pay for those adjustments. And as you know, non-represented folks also need to be adjusted to conform more in line with market, as we received the results of our non-rep salary survey that was completed late last year. So we need some money in the budget to help pay for those adjustments. We are also doing some succession planning for positions that we didn't anticipate were leaving, and bringing some folks online a little early in the process so that we can train, folks can train side by side for a certain period of time. And then of course there's the cash outs associated with people leaving. Those calculations are still in process. Also, we are going to be receiving another round of ARPA funds, probably in June. It's over $1 million. And we also, at some point in time, I don't know if it's going to be at this next, at the very first budget amendment for the year, but staff are in the process of preparing a spending plan for that over $2 million in sort of one-time money. Last but not least, we've got a small business rapid relief grants that council would like us to move forward. We're going to be paying for those out of the rainy day, and I'm in the process of kicking off that project with the chamber, who is going to be administering that program. And finally, there may or may not be a property purchase in the works. And so I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit about the city's financials for 2021. And as always, just let me know if you have got any questions, and have a great day.